Now, as we read these women's stories this morning, I want to offer just a quick word on context. Many of the narratives about women in Scripture center around fertility and pregnancy and motherhood. So a lot of value is determined by the birth abilities of women in ancient contexts. We see this in other places, not just in the Bible as well. I want to remind us as we're reading these stories that there is a large cultural gap between our context and the context of the Bible, both the Old and the New Testament, okay? And I want to name outright that I recognize that stories about pregnancy and birth and parenthood can deeply hurt, particularly for those who have had difficult experiences with any of those topics. All that to say, the point of these stories is not that women gain their value in childbirth. And I think that it can feel conflicting sometimes to consistently see women talked about that way in Scripture, especially when the ratio of stories about men and the ratio of stories about women in Scripture feels so uneven. It feels like if we want to uplift the voices and the stories of women in the Bible, we're stuck lifting up these stories about parenthood or pregnancy or birth because they're the only ones that we have. And to that, I say, yes, we will still lift up their stories. We will learn from our foremothers, and we will hold that their inherent value and the primary thing that we receive from their stories is not their ability or even their desire to procreate. And I guess this is the thing that we don't say because we feel like we shouldn't have to say it, but I'm just going to go ahead and say it. Women are so much more than their fertility or marital status. And it's to our collective detriment to view women with that kind of a narrow perspective. I just want to remind us of that as we're reading these stories this morning. And I want to acknowledge the tension and maybe even the inner conflict that some of us are holding as we hear stories like this. The Bible is not an instruction manual. It's also not a textbook. It would be so much easier if it was, right? But the stories in Scripture are not meant to just give us a bullet pointed list of this is how you live, this is what you're supposed to do, this is exactly what happened, and this is what would you do. That's not it. So the stories in Scripture do two things, okay? Scripture tells us about people first, and how they engaged with God. So Sarah and Elizabeth are women engaging with God, imperfectly, humanly engaging with God. They are women who waited on God, sometimes with hope and sometimes without hope. So in Genesis, Sarah overhears this message from the Lord that she's going to bear Abraham a son in her mature age, and she laughs. She laughs. In his commentary on Genesis, theologian Walter Brueggemann writes that the promise does not meet Sarah in receptive hopefulness, but in resistant hopelessness. Sarah knows what it is to wait on God. She knows what it means to hear God's promise and laugh at its ridiculousness in the face of reality, what she knows about herself and what she knows about the world around her. And in Luke, we know that Elizabeth waits while enduring disgrace. These are women who have waited. These are stories of people waiting for God. These are women who have waited, and these are women who have declared in their waiting that God met them in their waiting and that God did the thing that God said God would do.